deze groep controladers zeker ook voor een sterk.
Anders, hè?
Ja.
No, in the line. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
I can't see the audience anymore. Like this is better, I think. This is better, I think. Firstly, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Michiel Holtakkers. I entered the Dutch Parliament in June 2011, almost 1 year ago. I started the official parliamentarian work in September, of course, at the start of the political season. And my portfolios are environment, as well as the care for water security in the Netherlands, which is an important portfolio, but also parts of the defense portfolio. Before I entered, and that might be a matter of interest for today, before I entered Parliament, I served the Dutch police for more than 35 years. In that work, of course, I was quite a lot involved in things that had to do with weaponry, the use of arms. And that's why I can confirm, and that's also a reason to compliment our previous speaker, that he presented a fairly detailed, and as far as I can judge it, a fairly correct picture of the horrendous effects of the availability of weapons in a society. And I think he made an excellent distinction as well between the violence that's committed with weapons from states, by states, or by individual persons. And of course the use of violence and the use of weapons by individuals is illegal and has awful consequences. But the majority of the cases that were presented by Mr. Wood was violence from above, violence from states, violence from self-appointed dictators or people. And if you count on the numbers and of the victims of the problem, I think it's really serious, and it must have the highest attention of a government of the Netherlands, but also I think all the governments of modern international society. That's my first comment. Thank you for presenting that details when in the document. I made a few notes. What we all know from arms in society, that the availability of the arms is also stimulating the use of it. So the less weapons that are available in society, for what reason, for what reason, should be my dream as well, should be in favor of a policy. There should be no arms in a normal society, in a democratic society. It should be for the states only, and the use of arms should be very much restricted by clear rules on the level of the constitution and the formal laws. That's important. That's important.
The widespread availability of weapons, on compliance with humanitarian law, on delivery of assistance that the Red Cross and Red Cross societies carry out all over the world, and the impact on tension and casualties. And it naturally found, what we all know today and accept and don't question, that indeed when you allow weapons to end up in just anybody's hands without any regard to how they might be used, it facilitates violations of humanitarian law and human rights. It increases tensions and civilian casualties, and by doing so makes it much more difficult to provide assistance to victims, and so hampers delivery of assistance by our colleagues and puts them in danger as well.
The question you put forward to all of us, what would be your dream with the treaty? My dream with the treaty is twofold. I agree on everyone that the treaty should have a real body. It should have a real content. But the most important thing with legislation in general is that the mechanisms that can enforce the treaty should be well developed. So my focus should be, my dream would be that we could find out with the government and with the help of many of the civil organizations that are involved in the program, is a really credible and sound system of enforcement. If we only pledge to each other that we should ban the trade and the between trade and the re-export of arms, of course that's good, that's a start, it should be smartly regulated, but the enforcement in the system, that should be credible. And I think the Netherlands do have quite a lot of systems. Sometimes civilians are complaining about that, about the enforcement of our rules. That should be applied in the system as well. I think that should be my main element for the treaty in July. Another important, and I reflect also on the presentation of Mr. Wood, an important part of the treaty should be, of the system of the treaty, should be that as many as possible governments are involved and are committed to the treaty. That they are able and willing, I think it's a matter of willing as well, that they are willing to make a clear governments in any state, but also in the Netherlands. So thank you for that, and I always am at your disposal for getting information about that topic. If you have good ideas about the treaty, I could build it in.
All Geneva Conventions and customary law say that states parties to these conventions, and I should add that all countries on the planet are parties to the Geneva Conventions, have not only the duty to respect humanitarian law, that goes without saying, they've signed the conventions, but they also have the duty to ensure that other countries respect humanitarian law. And that means that a country that has nothing to do with a conflict on the other side of the planet, if it has any relations with where that country is, that conflict is happening, has a duty to try and prevent violations and not encourage violations. That's what's on the bottom of the slide. The duty to ensure respect means an obligation not to encourage and to do what you can to prevent violations. So when you step back and remember what we're talking about today, which is the trade in weapons, surely a country that has the duty to ensure that another country or another party has to comply with IHL, that country should carry out an assessment, think about whether the weapons being sent will encourage or will facilitate violations of humanitarian law. It's quite foreseeable. It's not a difficult thing to imagine. So this is the other departure point for our interest in the issue. Now, how does trying to ensure that there are fewer violations, there's a lower human cost to this widespread availability of weapons, how to do that in an arms trade treaty? Well, we talk about transfer criteria. These are the words that we use in negotiations. And they're the standard by which a country will decide whether or not to send weapons somewhere else. So they're the standards that states should apply when determining whether to authorize the transfer of arms. And to go into discussions we've had so far at the UN, for some of you this is extremely familiar, I know. There are two categories of criteria. The first is pretty obvious. It's based on existing obligations not to transfer. You have a UN Security Council embargo, you don't transfer weapons. That category of criteria would exist regardless of whether they're mentioned in a treaty or not. They exist. It's the second category of criteria that's the object of a lot of debate, a lot of controversy, and it's this category that would make a real difference on the ground by ensuring that weapons don't end up in the wrong hands. And they would be standards, criteria based on the potential consequences of the transfer. So requiring an assessment of the possible consequences through the use of weapons by looking at, for example, the risk of the use in violation of international law, international human rights law, or IHL.
Okay, here we are. Oh, sorry. As I said, important points for the Netherlands. Let me check whether I follow the right order. Yes, I do. For the Netherlands, as one of these 195 member states of the United Nations who are in that room in July, for us important a broad scope. The treaty should cover many different arms, as many as possible. Parts, components, technology, all the things actually were mentioned. We have even included riot munitions, internet filters, and dual-use equipment. And that is, I must say, a very ambitious goal. A very ambitious goal. I think even in the Union, European Union, we don't get applause when we say this. But that's how it is. You start somewhere and you'll see where you're at. Strong parameters, human rights, but also sustainable development, corruption, things like stability, internal, external stability, transparency. A very important point for us. The treaty will not have classical verification. Those of you who are familiar with arms control or disarmament knows that you have very, very intrusive verification systems sometimes. That probably will not happen with this treaty. Therefore, we need transparency. Countries should report first, how am I going to implement this treaty nationally? And perhaps even more important, in our view, they should, perhaps every year, report, I have issued the following licenses. And then we can see whether they have actually applied the treaty. There should be no qualitative threshold for entry into force. That may sound a bit technical, but there are some countries who say this treaty can only enter into force, can only become, let's say, an operating treaty if, well, 195 states have ratified it. That sounds nice, it's nonsense. It means it will never ever enter into force. And then all the work has been done for nothing. And it should include major exporters and importers to make the treaty meaningful. Again, I'm going too fast. Where does the Netherlands stand? I have to keep what I'm in let's say, in those who are favoring a strong and robust treaty. This is just a picture. This is not necessarily the Netherlands. I have to be clear on that. But certainly, if you look at this field, this is just to give you an impression. The skeptics, some of the countries were mentioned here, are certainly here. I think we are about here. This is basically quite a large group of countries. European Union, many African states, many Latin American states. Brian mentioned the countries in Latin America affected by domestic violence. Many of them are very much here ahead of the whole group. In the middle we have always countries who, well, they are not really enthusiastic with their wall block, but here is a problem. Because here there are countries, and I will talk about that, who really try to block a meaningful treaty in July. Again, I'm going too fast. Because here we are the role of the Netherlands. Well, here we have to ask, to keep it a little bit light, are we this or are we Calimero? For the younger audience, this was very popular when I was young, Calimero. What's the role of the Netherlands? As I said, we're one of the 195. And we should not overestimate our role, but we should not underestimate it either. We're active. We have been there from the start. And just the elements I give you to keep in mind when you think, what can the Netherlands do? First of all, remember the Union, European Union. That is important, because despite all what you read in the papers, and Mr. van der Linden already referred to the Euro crisis, that's perhaps not the best example of European cooperation, but the ADT can give quite a good example of European cooperation, because we share many points, and with 27, and already at 28, because Croatia already joins us in this respect more or less, we may have much more influence than just one member state. So it's important for the Netherlands not only to make sure that the EU plays an active role, but also to play an active role in the Union, to advocate in the Union that the Union takes a strong stand in these negotiations. And I think so far that goes pretty well. We are one of the vice presidents of the conference. That is to a large extent technical, but it gives you some say and some influence on how things are organized. And again, for those of you who are familiar with this work of multilateral diplomacy, procedure is often more important than substance. It's awful, but it's true.